Garden River First Nation, as is Jayce, and we're really honored to have them. Sue is an academic as well as a long-term activist with various initiatives, water initiatives, a herbicide alternatives initiative with Garden River. And Jayce has just returned from Scotland and the climate change meetings there with the various countries across the world. So without further ado, I would like to invite Sue to start the program.
All right, Miigwech, Rob, and welcome everybody. Thank you to the organizers for inviting Jayce and I. And we have a presentation that we will be doing this evening. If we can share it, there we go. So tonight we're going to talk about Annishinaabek worldview and climate change. So Nanabojo, Jayce Chiblow Dishnikaz, Ogama Anug, Minwa Wasnode Kwe, Indigo, Jajak Dodam, Kitagan ZB, Dunjaba, Annishinaabek Ojibwe and Dow, Kitagan ZB and Doug Nogam, Annishinaabek Aki and Dunjaba. So this is an image of the Great Lakes Territory. This is so in terms of a land acknowledgement, this is the territory that I'm responsible for, that these responsibilities have given to me by my ancestors and through creation and all of our relatives. So I wanted to point out that prior to settlers moving into this territory, that we had names for all of these places. We still have these names, and now we are bringing these names back to create an awareness that we were here, we were occupying this space, and we were caring for these lands. Intam Jayce.
Thanks. Hello, everyone. Minande Beneshi Quen Dishnakaz, Skitganzi Bean Donchba, Giko, Dodem, Annishinaabek Kwenda, for Moody Megwand and so thanks, Mom. As everyone knows, this is the mother and daughter duo here. I'm also from Garden River First Nation, but I currently live in unceded Coast Salish territories just outside of Vancouver in a town called Port Moody. And this is the territory of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, the Stolo, Coquitlam, and Musqueam nations. Actually, near where I live, I'm close to the ocean there, and this was a gathering place for those nations. They would come here to do a lot of harvesting of shellfish and mussels, and that is an area I visit all the time. So part of me in acknowledging this land is recognizing that even though I am Indigenous, this is not my territory. We're looking at a picture of where my territory is. So technically I'm a guest. And when it comes for me to do that kind of acknowledgement, it's more than just acknowledging the folks that were here and that were caretakers of this land, but it's also acknowledging the land itself and my relationship to that land. And more importantly, how I uplift the voices of the original peoples from this territory. So I've been working on connecting with a lot of those folks. That's part of my role as a guest in this territory. When I'm back home, it's a little different because it's my territory. I actually more focus on building relationships with the lands, the waters, the plants, and the animals. And for me, I think every land acknowledgement should include the recognition of all of the other beings that are non-human that have been caring for this land and living out their responsibilities, despite us humans kind of getting in the way of that. And I'll pass it back to my mom.
Oh, Miigwech. So in terms of an overview, I'm going to go first. I'm going to talk about Annishinaabek worldview, and then Jayce is going to share youth perspectives on climate change in Garden River and Indigenous Climate Action Youth Needs Assessment. And of course, we're going to try and give some time for questions, comments, and any type of knowledge anybody else would like to share. So first and foremost, we are situated on what we refer to as Turtle Island. This is part of our creation story that symbolizes that we were put here on this island, and all of the plants and the animals, the swimmers, all of those other beings assisted us so that we would be able to survive on what's now known as Canada, United States, and the tail is Mexico. And so we commonly refer to this as Turtle Island. Next slide, please. So one of the things I want to stress one is that, you know, as Anishinaabe people, and I won't talk about Indigenous peoples because I am Anishinaabe, and so I have those types of responsibilities, and we have our own creation story. We have our own language, which is Anishinaabe. We understand that we are the baby of creation. We understand that everything is alive. Everything has spirit. It is all imbued with spirit. We have 7 sacred teachings. Some people refer to them as grandfather teachings or grandmother teachings, and some people are actually referring to them as laws. These were what guide our behavior towards creation. We were governed through clan systems. We strive to live Minabamadzwin, which is walking the good life, living the good life. And in everything that we do, spirit comes first. So understanding that we have our own laws, we have 4 sets of laws that guide our behaviors on earth and assist us on how we're actually supposed to behave in this circle of life with all of creation. So a little bit about our clan systems. This actually comes from the Annishinaabek Nation. An elder, Gordon Wabadance, he's a fluent language speaker. He's done so much research on clan governance. They also have Annishinaabek Chinook Nagawin, which is the kind of like our constitution, I suppose we can call it. And so as you can see from this image, each clan had responsibilities. I'm Crane Clan, so I would have intergovernmental affairs, nation-to-nation relationships. But each clan is also represented by a color. It's also represented, if you could imagine this being a star, the 7-pointed star is very significant to us as Anishinaabe people because it also reminds us that we have responsibilities to the sky world, that we are part of that and we are part of that relationship. So it reminds us that we have responsibilities to Gizis, Debiki Gizis or Nokomis Gizis, which is the moon. And we have responsibilities to the sun, that each of them have laws that guide our behavior on earth. And this is all encompassing of actually who we are. And some people like to use the medicine wheel, but I was taught more about the seven stars, and each one of those stars, each one of those tips on the stars also represent the 7 lead medicines, so the 7 lead plants, the 7 types of waters. It's just a whole would be a whole course just on explaining and understanding what the 7-pointed star would actually mean. Next slide, please, Jayce. So in terms of Anishinaabe knowledge, as Anishinaabe peoples, when I speak to our elders and to our language speakers and I ask them, you know, how do we say knowledge? How do we say ontology and epistemology and all these fancy academic words? And what they tell me is that it's called Gikan Daswinmin, which means it is our knowledge. And it is a knowledge of place of peoples living in relationships on the lands with responsibilities to everything that's on the lands and to the sky world. And it's based on reciprocity. So not just taking, but giving something back, respect, relationships, and then a responsibility to that. And Anishinaabe knowledge is action-based. It actually has to be lived. We can't just learn it from a book. It is about connectiveness and then responsiveness. And that responsiveness means that understanding that we are in relationship, and it's a reciprocal relationship. It is drawn from all sources. We can read about it in books, but it actually can't be lived. It comes from the sun, the moon, the animals, the waters, the plants, the stars, the winds, the trees. It comes from everything. And typically, or it was told through storytelling, it's embedded within our songs, our language, and our ceremonies. It is interwoven with all life, and it is an all encompassing of all life. Elder Jim Dumont likes to talk about it as it's the intelligence of the spirit, the heart, the mind, and the physical. It's understanding that when we listen to hear and not to react. We listen so that our whole being can actually understand what's being told to us. And that way, when we relate to it, we see it, we understand it, and then we actually be it. And one of the important things that I'm going to say a couple times is, in terms of Annishinaabek knowledge, we are the land. And when I say land, I'm referring to everything. I'm not just referring to a piece of earth, I'm referring to the stars, and I'm referring to the waters. And this is really important as Annishinaabek peoples, because when we say we are the land, what we do to the land, we do to ourselves. Next slide, please, Jayce. I want to talk a little bit about the win, which is truth. And truth is that as Annishinaabek peoples, we're here occupying these lands. Goes back to that 5-pointed star. We had our governance systems, we had our medicines. We considered the earth our education system, our pharmacy, our kitchen. It's our home. It's literally our home. And the reason why I show this wampum belt, this is wampum belt of 1764. So some people know it as the Treaty of Niagara. And what's his name? Alan Corbier is our expert on wampum belts. And he explains that this is the first time that a wampum belt actually has human figures and numbers in it. And this is an agreement with the two people in the belt, the two human figures, with their arms locked to one another, showing that we will live in peace and that we will be respectful to each other. And then the 1764 indicates that this is the time that it was done. But one of the reasons why I like showing this belt is because, you know, in terms of Annishinaabek knowledge, we hear a lot of things like two-eyed seeing. Robin Kimmerer talks about braiding sweetgrass. Others talk about weaving Indigenous knowledge with Western science. And when I think about that as an Anishinaabe person, and I'm thinking, you know, did we really weave? We did bulrush rugs, but that was just a small component of everything that we did. And so when Alan talks about this belt, it's not a belt that you wear around your pants to hold up your pants. It's actually worn as kind of like a sash. And so the two ends are actually tied together, making it a full circle. And so when I talk about Indigenous science or Anishinaabe science and Western science, I talk about tying those together and locking our arms in place, respecting one another, and bringing our knowledge systems together so that we can help create some of the, well, we can help deal with the issues that we as humans have created on the earth. And so there are, there's also, many may have heard of the two-row wampum belt, but that's a Haudenosaunee belt with the Dutch. And people also refer to that as a system on how we can bring our knowledges together, because those processes and systems were already there. It's just that it hasn't been taught in educational institutions. So it's been kind of put on the back burner. And now as an Anishinaabe people, we are inside academia and we're starting to bring forth that these are the processes that we can use to bring our two knowledge systems together. Next slide, please. And again, I want to reiterate that we are the land. I worked with the Chiefs of Ontario as their environmental director for many years, and Elder Fred Kelly is the one who kept on trying to explain to the Nuclear Waste Management Organization that we are the land. And he explained on how it's based on respect, it's based on kindness, responsibilities, reciprocity, and relationships. And he talked about how we as human beings are interconnected through water. Our bodies are 70% water. So this connects us to our ancestors' waters, to the land's waters, to the animals, to the plants, to the birds, to fish, to all life. And because when we look at it, water doesn't go anywhere in terms of going out into space. It stays inside this big bubble that protects the earth. And that water keeps on just recycling itself. It's living its responsibilities, and it's keeping all of us as humanity interconnected to the rest of all of the beings that are on the earth. And because we are interconnected like that through the water, we have a responsibility to the past, to the present and to those future generations. And when I talk about, you know, you'll see people out doing demonstrations. Some people like to call them protesters. I refer to them as protectors, because the Mother Earth expects us to respect her. And because that is ingrained inside Annishinaabek knowledge, we stand up to protect the earth. So we are more of, we can be coined as protectors as opposed to, and I also one time was talking to an Annishinaabek fluent speaker and elder, and I said, well, maybe we can call ourselves responsibilists. And he's laughing at me. He goes, you can't just make up words. He says, we already have those words. And as Annishinaabek people, it's all embedded inside our language that we need to be respectful, because ultimately, when we look at it, Mother Earth is not dying. We as humans, we're actually killing her. So wanted to reiterate that, you know, the English language can be very tricky, and how Indigenous peoples, when we're standing up to provide education and to trying to stop destruction to the earth, that we get labeled, especially by the government and or by the policing types of communities. Next slide, please. Bintam, Jayce.
All right, I am going to stop sharing for a minute. I am going to reshare in a few minutes. I just wanted to kind of take a second to really listen to that and how that is important for what I'm going to talk about. So one of the big things that I wanted to talk about is the Conference of the Parties, that COP that happened in Glasgow, Scotland, with all of the high-level negotiators and state folks. But then I'm going to talk a little bit about the research that I did in my master's in Garden River, and talk about what the youth said that they needed in order to learn about their culture, what they wanted, and how they see that working. And then lastly, I'm going to go into, so I also work for Indigenous Climate Action as the toolkit training lead. And before that, I was the community engagement lead. So I participated in what Indigenous Climate Action did, was a youth needs assessment for young land defenders, so up to the age of, I think it was 30, and I was there to facilitate that session. So I think at any point that we're thinking about including Indigenous youth, that needs to be mentioned and highlighted, and those principles need to be included. So first thing I want to talk about, I just got back from Scotland. It was about a week ago, and it was a very interesting experience. I spent a lot of time with the Indigenous Peoples Caucus, because that was where, you know, our knowledge was valued and was held safe, and it was conducted in a way that it made everyone feel safe, and it was a community. And that was, and so the Indigenous Peoples Caucus is international, so that's from folks from all over the world. I got to meet Indigenous folks from Aotearoa, New Zealand, from Australia, and basically everywhere, Africa as well. It was an absolutely wonderful experience. I think one of the most important things, though, is that we collaborated together to create this space for Indigenous folks to have a voice at these conferences. So the Conference of the Parties, for this one that I'm talking about, it was the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So a lot of acronyms, really heavy acronyms that I'm just going to try and leave out because it gets really confusing, and then you'll be Googling it in the background, and it's just too much. But their main goal this year was to finalize Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And, you know, Indigenous folks were there. We were there advocating for the inclusion of Indigenous rights and human rights in general in a lot of aspects of Article 6, and all of the many subpoints of Article 6 where we thought that Indigenous rights and human rights in general should be respected. I guess the first thing I have to say is that this was one of the first times the UN has hosted an Indigenous knowledge holders gathering at one of their conferences. And that is a big step forward for Indigenous folks. It was Indigenous led, Indigenous organized, and it had Indigenous knowledge holders, elders, youth from all across the world, from the 7 different socioeconomic regions. That's how they break everybody up. And we actually had someone from Annishinaabek Nation, Quinn Migowaski, that was one of the knowledge holders there. And he did an absolutely excellent job offering, you know, youth perspectives on climate change from his experience and his on the land experience. Secondly, you know, there was a lot of contentious issues coming out of this COP, one of them being market-based solutions. And basically, just to keep that as simple as possible, it's one of the ways that the governments are going to try and the world is going to try and reach what they're calling net zero. So the net zero is basically, they're going to keep polluting, doing the same thing, business as usual, but they're going to start investing in different things, which are market-based solutions. One of them, for example, in Canada, it's going to be called Indigenous Conserved and Protected Areas. And the reason why that's such a concern is because the global South folks have been letting us know that they've included that this has happened in their territory. And unfortunately, you know, the industry gets, you know, a say in how biodiverse that land is. And this is an example of the REDD+ program that it was a failed attempt. They're basically just repackaging that and doing it as more carbon markets, carbon market-based systems. And the whole point of this that's so problematic is that it commodifies nature. And that in itself is not something that is Indigenous. Like from my experience, I have not seen Indigenous people think that that's a very good idea. Now, I know that there are some folks that are benefiting from these. So I think we need to also recognize that self-determination is really important in this situation. But lastly, you know, there were a couple other successes in the COP situation that happened this year. There's been a really positive relationship with Indigenous folks in the UK presidency. As for how that's going to go next year, we're not really sure. It's going to be in Europe, or sorry, Egypt. But they have included the rights of Indigenous peoples in some provisions of Article 6. But there are no independence grievance mechanisms and no way for us to, you know, really say this isn't working out for us, and how that process really works still needs to be determined. And that's going to be the purpose of the next conference of the parties. They're also, this is a statement I'm just like summarizing from the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change. That's where I was a part of. It's where the Indigenous Peoples Caucus is. It has all of the key points that Indigenous folks are fighting for at this place. So they were not impressed with the exclusion of our rights and the activity design and implementation. So how this all works, we're not being included in those higher level decision-making scenarios, which it directly impacts our lands and territories, like the example I gave you from the REDD+, where the Indigenous peoples in South America are being removed from their territories in order to further conserve the biodiverse land that they've already been protecting for thousands of generations. I can talk about this for so long, but I am going to start moving into the next one. I just wanted to lastly mention that there is the inclusion of seats for Indigenous folks, women and gender, on some of the boards, and getting more inclusive on gender acknowledgements within climate change. So this will be a much more high level. When we spoke to Minister Chiblow, we're still unsure of how that's going to play out in Canada. They have committed, not Canada, but the UN, they all agreed to commit to offering 1.7 billion for Indigenous-led solutions. And I think the next COP is going to be how that's going to be disseminated. Of course, folks that like at Indigenous Climate Action think that that should go to the frontline land defenders that are doing that work, that are protecting those lands, but it might be filtered through another process. So that's another thing that we're gonna have to figure out next year. So yeah, that's just summarizing the 2 weeks. It was basically 3 weeks that I was there. I can encourage you to continue reading up on it. It's really interesting. And Indigenous Climate Action actually released a couple reports on nature-based solutions, which are part of those carbon market systems. And we have a report on decolonizing climate policy that you can get on our website. And those are really important. They're Indigenous-led, Indigenous projects. Like one of my coworkers that is doing that with a wide variety of Indigenous folks from across so-called Canada. So that's one way you can learn a little bit more about that kind of work and how that looks. So I'm going to get into the next part, which is my master's research that I did in, feels like a while now. I think it was a few years ago. And my topic was Annishinaabek and climate justice, but using a Indigenous food sovereignty lens. So this is actually my territory. The picture on the left is a picture from High Bank, it's called. It's back in the bush back home. It's one of my most favorite places to go because you get to see the river. Sometimes you can see some eagles flying around. And then the photo on the right was a trail when we were out. Part of my research was learning how to trap and how to harvest animals. So that was one of the trails that we found. And I just thought it was really interesting how all of the animals come together so peacefully in nature when we're not there disrupting it. So I wanted to include these just as a way of like, this is what framed my research and why I did the things that I did. So I just quickly want to go over some terms because, you know, who knows what Indigenous food sovereignty is unless you're an academic. It's not something that we really use in our everyday language. But just for a broader sense, you know, climate change encompasses global warming, but it refers to the broader range of changes that are happening to our planet. And that is as a result of fossil fuels and putting out more heat trapping gases into the air. Secondly, Indigenous food sovereignty is a restorative framework that places responsibility and action on individuals and communities to repair and strengthen relationships to their ancestral homelands that were weakened by colonialism, globalization, and neoliberal policies. Again, really high-level terms, but the most important thing about Indigenous food sovereignty is that Indigenous folks are self-determining those medicines, those plants, their food, and those relationships with those foods. And that was why I wanted to include that in here. So I'm just going to stop sharing because my slideshow is a little like dry, to be completely honest. I didn't have any photos, but I did want to at least give you a brief idea of what we learned, what we did there, and a little bit about why I chose to do that route. So at the time, my mom was actually on council and we hosted a gathering with the youth, and it was in response to some crisis happening. And we wanted to know what the youth felt in Garden River would make them feel more safe in their community, more comfortable in themselves and in their culture, and how we can support that as, you know, people that are doing this kind of work. And what came out of that session was basically a whole lot of really wonderful ideas, like so many. One of them was being more on the land activities. So since that was leading up to when I was about to do and design my actual project, I thought, oh, this is a great opportunity for me to show that reciprocity with these young people, since I'm going to be asking them, you know, their opinions on climate change and their experiences with climate change. So for me to be an Indigenous researcher, it means that I have to give something back when I'm asking for something. That's reciprocity is really huge, and I wanted to make sure that I was doing that there. So more broadly, what we learned was that the Western education system needs a little bit of improvement in the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge, history, and traditions. The youth felt that that actually contributed to stigma around traditional harvesting practices and much more. So when I was designing my my project, I decided to use those relationships that I had been building throughout my master's and even before that with local trappers, hunters, and medicine people. And it came into what was a workshop. So I invited as many youth that wanted to come to the workshop, and I invited some medicine people and those hunters and those trappers, and they came and we all just had a really nice knowledge sharing session. And I am like by no means a trapper, and I probably am. When I do tan hides, they're very holy because I don't have that skill set yet, but I wanted to at least connect the youth with those people while I was asking those questions about climate change and building relationships with the youth at the same time. So I did do some one-on-one interviews, and then also the workshop style, which was conversation-based. You know, we just had open conversations. We just asked questions like, you know, what do you do when you're out on the land, and how do you connect with the land, and what are the changes that you're noticing in your lifetime? Because even young people like myself are seeing those climate changes in our community. And I also interviewed some of those trappers, those knowledge keepers, and the medicine people because they're directly tied to the land. And I really wanted an intergenerational approach because, you know, that's the way we do things as Annishinaabek people. So more specifically with climate change impacts, every single time we talked about one of the themes, people brought up the aerial herbicide spraying happening in our territory. This is actually happening all over so-called Canada, and it's glyphosate that they use, and it's been known to cause cancer. I think it's non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So that's a direct result of like my mom's work and her land defense that's kind of really brought me into that one, and learning from the elders, the TEK, the traditional ecological knowledge elders who have been actively fighting against aerial herbicide spraying in our region and in so-called Canada in general. And they believe that that is contributing to not just climate change, but also all of these broader impacts that I'm going to talk about. So I guess before I get into the impacts themselves, it's important to note that for Indigenous folks, everything is interconnected for us. It's not as easy to compartmentalize and say that this is not a part of climate change, because for us it is. It's all interconnected and it all relates because it's all changes to Mother Earth. So that's why I think a lot of folks were bringing up the herbicide spraying, is because they're seeing the impacts directly on our land from that. So more specifically, the climate change impacts included, the typical water and snow level changes. And they got into a little bit more specific, more like storytelling is a very active way that I found the research to come through. People would tell me stories, and then from there I would have to reflect and try and take out the knowledge pieces from that, because the older folks really like to use stories, which is a great way for us to learn, and it's one of our learning methodologies. I just wanted to point out in the chat, thanks, Kara. Stop the Spray is an active group on Facebook if you want to learn more about what folks are doing to stop the aerial herbicide spraying. So the climate change impacts continued would be larger wildlife. So some of the larger animals are experiencing a decline in food availability from the changes in deforestation. So that was one of the spots where people were saying it's because of the aerial herbicide spraying, our plants aren't growing. If they are growing, they're damaged, they're not well, they're sick plants. So that was just in general the distribution. So how many there are, where they are, the overall abundance as well, and the health of the medicines and foods have significantly decreased in the lifetime of those older folks that have that direct experience. And then also one of the most important things that this one person brought up is that the animal behavioral changes. Because the temperatures are changing, animals have to migrate to match those temperatures, or for example, they're coming out of hibernation earlier because of the temperature changes. And we're only seeing the small impacts of that. Because one of the things of the Paris Agreement that I forgot to mention is it's the goal of trying to return to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, which in general is not going to happen. With the current methods that they're doing, it's not enough. Just to summarize the COP in one sentence, just not enough. And then those were some of the most important things. And when the youth were talking about, how do they connect with the land when the land is changing? As a young person myself who was going out trapping and not being able to get anything because half of the animals are gone, or most of them are gone, or sick, or not well, and we can't eat some of them anymore. So as someone that's trying to learn my culture and learn about the language, our way of life and everything, it's based off of those plants and animals and off the health of the land. So for me to go through and try to learn those things while they're moving, migrating, or dying, it becomes increasingly difficult. Mom, did you want to add something there? Saw you come off mute. No? Okay. I'm getting close to the end, kind of. So I'm going to share my screen for this last little piece. This is just the part 2 of my part 3 thing here. So I'm going to reshare this just because it's important. So moving forward in the future, these are the recommendations by the youth in Garden River. And interestingly enough, they align with a lot of the things that we're going to talk about in the youth needs assessment that Indigenous Climate Action did. As I mentioned, more on the land activities alongside Western education. They didn't want it to be so separate. They actually wanted to be learning them at the same time and valued in the same way. So that could look like outdoor education camps, as many outdoor activities as possible, seasonal programs or retreats for youth that have the knowledge keepers there so that they can build those relationships and eventually, reach out to those folks one-on-one. And surprisingly, they wanted an Ojibwe school in our community. I have to include this because this is what they said they wanted. They wanted this to learn the teachings from elders and knowledge keepers within our community, but also to have motivation workshops to keep youth inspired and continuing their education, because they felt that that was really important. And I think lastly, one of the most important things that came from my research was that the community needs to come together and support each other. The youth were saying that they didn't feel supported by even their own family members or older folks in learning this kind of thing. And they just told stories about how they would try to learn and people would just tell them no, or you don't need to know this. And so the most important thing is definitely having the community come together and support each other in these initiatives, and teaching each other so that we can learn as a community as opposed to individuals. So that knowledge sharing that we go through. Okay, so lastly, I'm going to get into the ICA Youth Needs Assessment, and then after this, we can get into some questions potentially. This won't take too long. The purpose of this was ICA is developing, so ICA is Indigenous Climate Action. That is where my full-time work is right now. I'm the toolkit training lead. I run a climate leadership workshop program for Indigenous peoples across so-called Canada. Part of my role was to help our youth engagement lead on this. So this is what we use to design our youth programming. And I think it's important for everyone to know, if you're going to be working with youth, these are some of the key points that they brought up from across so-called Canada. So this time I'll be talking about Indigenous folks, because this encompasses Métis, First Nation, and Inuit. So some of the motivations, this is more specifically for land defense and climate action. Their motivations include the importance of connection to the land, future generations, and also there's those traditional cultural values and practices. They really talked about that you know, in that intergenerational transfer of knowledge was key for them to want to participate. And just similar how, you know, I mentioned earlier that like I was inspired by a lot of the work my mom did. This was what a lot of the youth said as well, is that they were impacted by family members that have been doing this work, or family members that have experienced climate change and are experiencing it right now, that they want to support and learn more about. But also it is a way to understand their culture and identity, because as I mentioned, our identity is tied to the land. So it's really important for us to have those relationships also with community. And then in general, preserving the environment for future generations. These were young people that were thinking 7 generations. So basically 150 years into the future. That is why they're doing this work, which I think is really important. And lastly, they mentioned that one of their biggest motivations is actually resisting systemic oppression, such as colonialism, racism, patriarchy, and we're focusing on creating equitable, inclusive climate solutions, and that support Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous self-determination. So I wanted to include some of these quotes from the report. I will link it in the chat after this. I just can't like exit my screen at the same time. So several youth expressed that their backgrounds provided access to traditional teachings, community support, and connections to the lands and waters. However, they also identified experiences of racial discrimination, lack of resources and opportunities, mental health impacts, and lack of access to traditional territories and teachings, especially those that are located in urban centers. Having access to traditional territories was a challenge for them. And when they were talking about lack of resources and opportunities, that was financially, finance was a burden. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And secondly, the quote that I wanted to also include is, "It became apparent that systems of oppression, dispossession, and disempowerment impact the lives of Indigenous youth. Urbanized and displaced youth expressed that limited access to traditional land and cultural teachings results in loss of language, cultural values, and knowledge of the land," which I wanted to include because that was very similar to the results of my research in Garden River, where youth want to make those connections. But when you're losing access to that traditional land, to that land that is healthy and well, it's harder for you to build those relationships when they're all leaving or dying or are sick and unwell. So moving forward, they suggested that, you know, solutions for Indigenous youth to be included in climate change movements must be grounded in asserting Indigenous sovereignty and rights. I think that goes all across the board for all folks, not just Indigenous youth, but for all Indigenous folks. Indigenous sovereignty, Indigenous self-determination, and led solutions are the solution to the climate crisis. So that all of these must include focusing on creating inclusive spaces for engagement. And that means gender inclusivity, identity inclusivity, allowing folks to just show up how they are and how they want to be there. So like sometimes in my program, people don't want to turn on their cameras, especially youth, and that's okay. That's allowed as long as they're still there learning, and, you know, even just typing in the chat or giving me thumbs up, that's good enough for me. As long as they're learning and they're showing up, that's good enough. So the solutions also must focus on building stronger relationships to the land, building community support, and also relationships, similar to what the results of my research was as well. And solutions must respect Indigenous knowledge. I think that's a given for all climate change solutions should respect Indigenous knowledge. Lastly, they talked about the importance of increasing the accessibility of resources and opportunities that are Indigenous led and culturally appropriate. Accessibility of resources came down to funding. A lot of these youth said that they wanted to attend, for example, a climate change gathering that was happening about an hour drive away, but they don't have a vehicle. They don't have the money up front to front things like a bus pass to get there, or a bus, you know, whatever. So what ICA now does, and we took this very seriously, is we now offer a youth honorarium, or we call it a youth reciprocity. So for them showing up, they're given funds just to show up. And then they're given funds for a cell phone internet subsidy if they need to be, especially for my program, if they need to be online. That's one way that we support that. And then we also offer childcare subsidies and internet subsidies and food subsidies. And this can be requested upfront so that there's no barriers. It's really about removing that financial barrier for youth to participate, because they want to be there, but sometimes they just don't have the funds to be there. So one of the things at ICA is that we will make sure that that is not a barrier. And I think everyone should take that feedback in when they're working with Indigenous youth and climate change, or just in general. They also wanted to, yeah, there's the last part, supporting youth financially to participate in any gatherings. That is really important. But also when it comes to accessibility of resources, the language that we use is really important for how we communicate with young people. We at ICA are doing things like Instagram, social media, and breaking it into much smaller community reports, as opposed to our typical academic reports, or the ones where it's like a 10-page paper that you need to read to get, you know, like 3 sentences of information. We'll just summarize that for people and put it on our social media. And that's the best way that we can make it accessible as of right now. We also have, you know, like I said, that climate leadership program that we're doing as an opportunity for youth and anyone that's Indigenous to get involved in climate change, to learn more about climate change from an Indigenous perspective. So I just wanted to include, these are some links. The links to Indigenous Climate Action's website is there. We have a blog, and that blog has a ton of different resources, many, and then you can also look for our decolonizing climate policy page, and that has a lot of those reports that I mentioned earlier. And then lastly, we have a page focused on just transition, which is another one of our programs that focuses on, you know, renewable energy solutions. And then the second link I put there is an old project that I used to work on that also does really great climate change work. It's the Indigenous Environmental Justice Project out of York University, led by Dr. Deb McGregor. They have a lot of Indigenous folks that work on this project, and it has a lot of really helpful resources and readings, and they do a lot of events that are local to, you know, Annishinaabek territory. So if you're interested in that, those are the links that you'd want to go to learn a little bit more. So I'm going to stop sharing. And yeah, I think we have some time for questions. Or Mum, did you want to add anything before we move to that?
No, yeah, definitely. I think we have some time for questions, comments, or if anybody wants to ask, you know, anything else about anything that we presented, or just even share their knowledge. You know, this for me is a type of forum where we can do that. Or just post in the chat. That also works.
So would you like people to raise their hand, Sue and JC, or how would you like to do this?
Yeah, if they want to raise their hand, that way we're not stumbling over one another, that would be perfect.
Okay, maybe I'll start with a question myself. I just wondered if there's other regional Indigenous groups. Certainly JC's given us an excellent overview of youth groups, but I'm wondering if you might like to address other regional Indigenous groups that are in a broader sense addressing climate change issues. Perhaps the elders in the herbicide alternatives area, or perhaps the water issues that that you've been involved in?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I think is important to remember is when we're working with elders, the terminology that we use. So when we talk about climate change, they typically will refer to differences that they've seen in snow, the amount of snow, the water levels, the movement of the animals, the lack of the animals, the lack of the birds that we don't see anymore that used to be here. So the way they focus on it is that we need to stop destroying the earth. We need to stop killing her. And one small way that we can begin to do that is to put a moratorium on herbicide spraying. Quebec doesn't use it, but Ontario uses it. There's other provinces in Ontario that don't use it, but BC uses it. In Europe, they don't use it at all. And so, you know, putting pressure on Canada to catch up with the times, I suppose, and using alternative methods. But in terms of regional or local groups, there's also the Robinson Huron, Wawa Windaw, which is the Robinson Huron Treaty Organization. They've been doing different work, and more recently, the Annishinaabek Nation, which was or is the Union of Ontario Indians, is also doing a climate project. The TK elders and myself were on a call with them. They're going to be sending out surveys, hosting mini workshops on Zoom for those who can participate on Zoom, because it's important to remember that most elders do not have computers, never mind internet. So some of that is happening at a local level or regionally. I'm not sure exactly if the Chiefs of Ontario is, oh yes, the Chiefs of Ontario does have Lillian Trapper, who is Mishkigo, as a climate change person there. Don't exactly know what they've been doing though. I haven't been keeping up on that because I'm sure many of you know, trying to complete a PhD really takes up a lot of your time. So I don't know if Jayce, if you know of anybody. I know, for example, Christy and Isaac were Quinn. So Nimki Ajbakong is a land-based learning camp. A lot of different people go out there and participate in different activities. They host all types of ceremonies. They host all types of workshops. I've utilized their facilities numerous times to get people out of the cement walls or the paper walls and into a more natural setting. So those types of activities, I think, are part of what Jayce is talking about, that need to happen to increase the awareness of what's happening with climate change. So I think that type of work is also happening. And yeah, that, I don't know, Jayce, if you have any to add.
No, I just linked Nimki Ashbakong in the chat, because that is one of the that's one of the groups that actually Indigenous Climate Action works with. So they live real net zero, like they live zero waste. That's what they live. They live off of the land. They live in reciprocity with the land, and they live very humbly, and they're just out there doing it. And there's so many, yeah, Kara, again, great links there. There's so many other groups that are doing this as well. Dene Nawo, and of course now I'm going to get more national because that's where I work. Totally following Indigenous Climate Action is one of the ways that you can see smaller groups that are working, because we share and amplify a lot of different Indigenous voices. As this person mentioned, you know, there's a lot of frontline actions happening right now, especially in Wet'suwet'en, where one of my coworkers was violently arrested by the RCMP inside her house. And Tiny House Warriors is another group that's fighting the pipeline right now. And I think one of the most important things, especially for people that are in Sault Ste. Marie area, is that Line 5 is coming. So there's a pipeline that's being proposed that's going to be coming through the Great Lakes. Currently it's at about, I think, Line 3, but eventually it will come through right through the Mackinac Straits. So directly potentially impacting all of us. So it's really important to watch all of these other groups and how they're being treated, so that we can learn from those experiences, collaborate with them, so that if it does come to the point of the pipeline being here, that we have the right methods for stopping it. I see Paul has a question there, Mom. I'm going to read it to you.
Yeah. Thanks.
We hear about climate change mitigation and adaptation. Does Indigenous knowledge focus on one of these more than the other?
I don't necessarily think so. I think what has happened in many instances is that accessing funding is always a challenge. And a lot of times these funding opportunities dictate to you what you should be doing. So in terms of mitigation, that wasn't really, you know, a huge opportunity, but there was more of adaptation. How are we going to adapt to flooding, forest fires, those types of weather activities? And so a lot of money was being offered to the First Nation communities to develop those types of plans, but there was really no mitigation measures being actually looked at. But Dr. Kyle White, who is Potawatomi, he is with the State University of Michigan. He was with Michigan University, now he's with the University of Michigan, and I do believe he's an Indigenous advisor to the US president, but he has done a lot of work with climate change and talks about it as Jayce has mentioned, Indigenous sovereignty. He's also worked with tribal communities in the United States with his own communities, and they've done these huge mitigation plans, and they're absolutely amazing. Up here on the north side of that imaginary line, as far as I know, there hasn't been a lot of mitigation plans done, but maybe Jayce might have more insight on that than me.
Like kinda. I mean, it really depends because there's so many different, I just need to like bring it back for a second here. There's so many different Indigenous nations in so-called Canada right now, and some folks are more focused on climate change mitigation because that's what they need for themselves right now to in order to adapt. The other one is, yeah, it really all just depends on the community and what they need, which is why I mentioned the importance of Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous self-determination. So allowing communities to say, this is what we need, and then doing it that way, as opposed to the government, you know, offering these funds and saying, this is what we want you to do. We want to completely flip that and have the government just support what each community actually needs, as opposed to trying to fit into the government boxes of funding and altering your project so that it matches their idea of net zero. And I'm just looking at the chat here. I'm seeing Claudette ask, my questions just were very guidance. It was guided questions. It ended up being, I really focused on conversation based. So as I was asking, you know, the typical, like, what are you noticing in the water? What are you noticing with the plants? How do you connect with those plants and animals? Those were some of the questions, but I would actually, in the session or in the conversation, pull out other questions as I was talking to them, because I wanted it to be more conversation based, because that's much more in line with how I think Indigenous folks should be doing research, as opposed to just asking singular questions. So I did in-person conversations, not so much like a survey. And engaging with members was a challenge, just because we didn't have the same kind of social media resources that we do now at the time. Youth are very into social media, so that was something that we didn't have. Garden River now has a couple of really great groups that they use for communications, but we just didn't have that at the time. So we did a lot of work through the education department at the Garden River, what are they called? Garden River Education Center, anyway, down at the rec center. They were really helpful. I reached out to them. We reached out to them, and they were the ones that helped disseminate a lot of that information to the youth. So really leaning on those kinds of partnerships would be my recommendation.
Great. And Isabel's talking about how her community, her band was actually given money to implement an emergency preparedness plan, and that was kind of like the flavor of the day. And so communities were given that money to implement emergency plans, which really has nothing to do with adaptation or even collecting Indigenous knowledge on how we can adapt, and even in the emergency plan, because that boils down to, you know, if there's a flooding, how are you going to get everybody, and where's everybody going to go, and those types of activities. It doesn't actually deal with the problem. It just kind of moves everybody into a different area so that we don't have loss of human life, right? But meanwhile, we're not even thinking about what's happening to all of the plants and the animals and everything else. So that is one of the huge challenges, is that government comes up with flavor of the day, and then everybody kind of flows that way. So yeah.
Yeah, you're really limited.
As well.
You're limited on what you can do. Like when they say the project has to be this certain way, and then you're only allowed, like for myself, I was only allowed to interview 15 people. Actually, it was 10, but I kind of pushed to have 5 more. So.
Yeah.
That's kind of just pointing to like what we just mentioned about how it should be determined by Indigenous folks what's needed and what that study should look like. So I personally don't think 15 is even close to enough, but I think Isabel would probably be in agreement with that. And it's not on the person that's applying for these, it's actually more on the people that are making those decisions higher level in the policy that determine where the funding goes and how it gets to those people.
Yeah, because we have like 500 people in our band, and I don't think 15 is representative of, you know, the band itself.
Definitely.
Sure.
I would agree with that. I see Mark has a question.
Oh.
Probably our last one. We're getting close to the end of time here.
Hi, Miigwech for your presentation. Can you tell us more about kind of on the land changes that the Garden River members are noticing due to climate change? Like I heard down Bruce Peninsula, they're noticing failures in the whitefish spawning, and they think it's maybe due to silting of the lake bed or water temperature changes. Can you tell us more about anything along those lines that Garden River is noticing?
Yeah, I can keep it a
Um,
little bit more. Sorry, Mom, I'll just really quickly. I didn't talk about
Okay.
the specific examples that folks gave us, but some of them included less muskrat and less beaver in our waters. And that could be because of the temperature rise. It could be because of pollution, water level changes, you know, that really interconnectedness. And then also people talked about a lot of our traditional medicines being much more sparse, so being harder to find. And when they do find them, there's much less of them, and their health, the plant health usually is not actually that great. So that itself is like some other larger ones. And then also the animals are migrating to match the temperature that they need. So for example, one of the people was talking about how we didn't actually originally have deer in our territory, but they migrated up along with the temperature. But those are just some quick examples. I know my mom probably has a lot more to add.
No, actually what I was going to add was there's, I don't know how many of you are aware of the Nordic Institute. I'm a research associate there, and they did their AGM last night, and there was some amazing presentations that were done that is happening right here in Algoma and done by people from Algoma area. But one of the presentations that was done was, I found really interesting, of course, because it was on water, but it was actually done with Garden River First Nation, and they were doing water sampling. So they were also looking at benthic, which are like the little bugs that you don't actually see in the water, and they're kind of under the sand and hide on the different debris in the water. And they are part of putting that data into a program called Data Stream. So apparently everybody can access this, and you can Google it, because I didn't have time today to try and find the link for it, but it shows different specific locations. And so now there are actually locations in Garden River where there's data is actually in there, and you can push on that and it tells you different types of things that are happening. So this is good information, I think, to have and to be able to share, because we talk about, you know, we live along the St. Mary's River, Sault Ste. Marie, Garden River, you know, Thessalon, Lake Huron, and these are shared waters, right? The International Joint Commission, we have the Canada-Ontario Water Agreement, we have all of these different agreements that we're supposed to be looking at sharing the responsibility for these waters. And Sault Ste. Marie is still listed as a hotspot, which means that Sault Ste. Marie, the St. Mary's River in Sault Ste. Marie is very, very contaminated, unsafe, very unsafe. So this data stream is part of promoting that type of sharing and how we can actually work together and add more. And then there is another website, I might have to, Carex, I think it's called Carex. And you can look at that one and you push on a pin that's dropped on a map, and it'll show the community, and it'll show the type of contaminants that are at that community. So these types of activities that are happening, I think are, you know, we need data to be able to support some of the activities that we do, because unfortunately, Jayce mentioned, Indigenous knowledge is still not recognized or acknowledged or respected as an equal with when we're sitting at the table. So those types of activities, I think, are really helping gathering baseline data so that we can start looking at how climate change has affected and paralleling that with what Indigenous knowledge holders and trappers and hunters and fishers and the harvesters, what they're actually saying.
I just want to quickly add to that, because one of the things that I experienced at the COP was discrimination against Indigenous knowledge holders in itself. I know we got to go, but lastly, while we were there, you know, the International Government Panel on Climate Change puts out all these reports, and they are the most respected and highest level of climate change knowledge according to Western society. Well, we had someone come to the Indigenous Peoples Pavilion and present to us about how, you know, all that works. So they usually use scientific articles, government reports, et cetera, et cetera. And when he said, this person said literally word for word, that Indigenous knowledge just doesn't have the quality assurance, the same quality assurance as Western knowledge does. And in that moment, I was completely enraged and frustrated, because that is against, like, he said this to a room of Indigenous people from across the world, comfortably. And so one of the things that he then put on us as Indigenous folks was that we need to come up with our own quality assurance mechanisms for them to include Indigenous knowledge in climate change reporting at the highest level at the United Nations. That was one of the most frustrating experiences I had while being there, because he not only just said that our knowledge wasn't good enough for them, he then said that we have to lump all Indigenous peoples from across the world into one, so that we have our own quality assurance, which completely erases so many different cultures and approaches to knowledge that is just not good. So that's happening at all levels, that discrimination and that like literal active exclusion of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous peoples, which is why this kind of work is so important. The work of frontline land defenders is so important, because their work informs things like organizations like Indigenous Climate Action, who's negotiating and amplifying those voices at those higher levels. I just had to include that since we were talking about that, and it was just made me really enraged. I felt like I had to share that with everyone. But I think, I don't know if I want to pass it back to Rob.
Well, actually, I would like to sneak in one more question, and we could be cut off. But one of the things that we talked about, a fascinating presentation, Indigenous knowledge. But the thing that struck me, and maybe this is Indigenous knowledge, is the worldview. And so I'm wondering if you see some way to share that with, or is that shared amongst different Indigenous communities? And is there some way to share that with non-Indigenous communities in a way that they can, well, actually understand and perhaps embrace that sort of worldview?
You want to go first?
So, give them, Jay.
Okay, I'm not gonna lie, I was reading the chat at the same time. Can you just briefly recap what the question was?
Okay, it has to do with the worldview. So I understand that's, Indigenous knowledge involves a worldview, but to me, it's the worldview of how you see your relationship to the land, to Mother Earth, to the sun, to the stars. And do you see, is that something, number one, shared by most Indigenous communities? And secondly, do you see a way of being able to share that effectively with non-Indigenous communities?
So
Yes.
if we're going, yeah, go ahead.
So, yeah, so there are overarching, I would say, we can refer to them as principles right now. So for example, all Indigenous peoples believe that all life is imbued with spirit. And so that's kind of like an overarching principle. And I'm pretty sure that's shared commonly with everybody. And it's inside a kind of academic articles. It's like all over the place, right? So, but just remembering, I come from the Great Lakes territory, so I would not be able to be out of the East Coast and try to do any type of harvesting, because that's not my responsibility. I would have to ask permission to do that, and I wouldn't know how to do it. Sure, maybe I could Google, how to set a net or how to find some mussels, but again, that's not being responsible to that territory. So I think there are I just was looking at a literature review that was done today, and there are several scholars that have talked about, and they're Indigenous scholars too, like Dr. Deb McGregor, Amy Kraft, Kyle White, Sean Wilson. There's Susan Van de Perter. There's just so many of them that are out there that have talked about how this can actually be done. But understanding again that going into each community, it's going to be specific to that community. It's not going to be one shoe fits everybody. Jayce, did you want to add?
That was basically what I was going to say, is that, you know, since I work at the national level, I see that there are some similarities when it comes to the morals of our teachings, but there's also some things that we actually cannot share. It really depends on the seasons, the kind of stories that we tell. And then at some points we can't like tell some stories at all. But for non-Indigenous folks, you know, there's tons of books and resources out there for them to read. You know, I guess one of the first things that I would recommend would be Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass. It's a really great book. And there's so many more that you can literally, like if you're on Amazon, they'll start recommending more and more for you, and you'll get into an awesome rabbit hole of Indigenous people that are sharing their experiences. And that's one of the ways. But I guess in the future, you know, Indigenous Climate Action is developing in potentially 2 to 3 years, a way for non-Indigenous folks to engage in Indigenous-led climate solutions and climate action, but we need to first hear from communities on how they want that, and how we can make sure that there's protection safeguards for Indigenous knowledge, because not all of our knowledge is shareable with non-Indigenous folks because it's meant for us. So there's some aspects we can share, but some that we can't. So it's kind of, that's going to be determined on the communities again, and the people that hold that knowledge on what they can share and who they can share it with. But first of all, it's, if you do want to start learning that kind of stuff, start with the books, but you need to make relationships with Indigenous folks, but also be mindful when you're asking Indigenous folks to share these kinds of things, these kinds of information, because it's traumatic and it's exhausting for some folks to explain to non-Indigenous people our knowledge, because it's just ingrained in who we are. So it's a lot harder for us sometimes, even as youth, to just give out that information without, again, that reciprocity being offered. So just be mindful of what you're asking of folks. If you are going to go and make relationships with Indigenous peoples, just make sure that you're thinking about the potential trauma that you could be putting them through. You know, asking land defenders about their experiences can be them reliving that trauma, for example. So make sure that you're at least considering that if that's something that you're going to be doing.
Yes, and also too, Greg put not everyone feels that way, and you're 100% right. There always seems to be one bad apple in the crowd, right? But you know, that part of that whole, when we talk about that reciprocity, like I'm an Annishinaabek person, and I know tons and tons and tons of Annishinaabek peoples just from the previous employment that I had, the ceremonies that I participated in, and all of these things. And part of that reciprocity is some of these elders have asked me to write books for them. So they've given me a box full of memoirs and papers that they've written and asked me to compile it and put it into a book format for them. And so these types of things, and then I think it's absolutely amazing, because then I get to call them and say, so can I come for a visit? Because like, I want to hear more about this piece that you wrote about and these sorts of things. And I've always tried to explain to government back in the day when I was with the Chiefs of Ontario, is that these relationships are not one-off relationships. It's a continual relationship, and Kim Tallbear talks about standing with, not just acknowledging and respecting the knowledge that's being shared, but actually standing with it. And I think Dr. Deb McGregor has asked, are you actually even ready to do that? And that's a question you have to ask yourself. Are you ready to stand with those people and stand with their knowledge? So I think those sorts of things are also really important in that type of conversation that we're having.
Well, thank you so much. That was engaging and fascinating and very provocative take through a worldview and Indigenous knowledge. And it certainly seems like in a lot of ways that Indigenous communities have it more together than non-Indigenous communities in terms of moving forward in in a way that respects the earth, including climate change related activities. So again, I'd like to thank you so much for doing this for us. As far as the Climate Hub goes, we will be taking a break over Christmas. We will start again after Christmas. I think we're going to be going every second month then with the webinars, but we certainly look forward to everyone joining us again, and we will be coming up with a schedule of events in the near future. So thanks again, Sue and Jayce. Miigwech.
Bye.